Okay, we're going to get started. And okay, great. So first, welcome to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, and thank you all for joining us. My name is EDITH SKLAROFF, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Penn. This event is part of the Andrea Mitchell Center's Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy series. So thank you so much to the center's Dr. Jeff Green and Dr. Matt Roth for hosting us. Today, we are being joined by Peter Frase. Frase is a writer and socialist organizer living in New York's Hudson Valley. He was a founding editor of Jacobin magazine and is the author of Four Futures, published by Verso in 2016, which we'll be talking about today, and which uses speculative fiction and radical theory to imagine possible successor systems to capitalism. He is currently working on a project that analyzes the false technological promises of capitalism after the 2008 financial crisis and the resulting economy of scams and asset bubbles. Today, we will be discussing his 2016 work and thinking through how the past few years of political, ecological, and social upheaval have shaped how we might think about the future. Peter's book speculates about four possible versions of the future: communism, rentism, socialism, and exterminism, bringing to life what humanity may face in the coming decades. It's a pretty unique work, so I think instead of attempting to summarize it too much more, I'll just launch right into talking with Peter. We'll have about 45 minutes of us talking, and then we'll open it up for 45 minutes of audience Q&A. You can put your questions in at any time, so please go ahead and do that as they occur, and we'll try to work through as many of them as possible at the in the second half of the event. So first, welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
So we'll just launch right into sort of like the big assumptions, premises of the book. And so you start from the premise that the two crises that will most shape our future are climate crisis and automation. 7 years later, post-Trump, and still in the pandemic, are those the same two crises that you would choose now? How has the intensity of how has the last few years changed the intensity of those crises or not?
So I guess, well, to take in some ways the easier one of those to answer, I mean, the consequences of the climate crisis have only continued to sort of gather pace and intensify. I think, it's more, it's certainly to me much more present and top of mind now, even than it was when the project that led to the book started. That's the, how we deal with how quickly we are able to decarbonize and how we deal with the already kind of cooked in consequences of, what capitalism has done through carbon emissions and its overall impact on the planet. I mean, that's going to shape everything about what, the coming years are going to look like. And, if anything, each passing year, the sort of severity and the rapidity with which, rapid climate change is happening becomes much more and more obvious that it's an immediate crisis rather than one that's sort of on the horizon. The automation piece is a little bit more complicated. I mean, I guess where I would sort of go with that is, well, a couple of things. I think, one of the ways I sort of characterized the environment in which I was writing the book was in what I called sort of a wave of automation anxiety, which is a recurring thing in capitalist economies that goes back, to the Industrial Revolution, at least. This idea that capitalism's drive to increase productivity is eventually going to displace all the workers and replace them with machines, and what's to become of us, right? And I felt like 10 years ago, maybe, or so, we were sort of hitting another sort of high point of that kind of anxiety about the robots taking all of our jobs. But one of the things that I even in the book sort of tried to do, this was a sort of a side point because the point of the book was to sort of take this automation as this kind of premise and then play out some scenarios from there. But what I wanted to be clear about is that it's a mistake to think that there's an inevitability to this process of replacing human labor with robots or algorithms or whatever. And which is the way it's often portrayed in the sort of the literature of automation anxiety, whether it's coming from the business press or from politicians or whatever. There's a tendency in that direction, of course, because, again, of this drive to increase productivity in order to increase profits that capitalism has. But that tendency has other counter tendencies. And the main counter tendency, as I see it, is what the strength of labor is. That is, what workers are able to organize for and demand. And so if you have a workforce that is low wage, that is precarious, that is disorganized, that can essentially be used cheaper and easier than machines, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a low-wage labor economy rather than an automated economy. And I think on top of that, what we've seen is that a lot of, even my own sort of skepticism about where the technology was 10 years ago was in certain ways not skeptical enough. Because I think what we've seen is that even in moments, as we've had occasionally in recent years, of tighter labor markets, some upsurge in union organizing, all the things you would sort of expect to put pressure on capitalists to do the thing they always threaten to do, which is, if you organize or if you demand higher wages or whatever, we'll just replace you all with machines. But I think what we're seeing is that to a certain degree, that's a false threat, that technology is not there. And we could go into some of the many examples of this. Like, my favorite one to go to is always the self-driving car, which was supposed to, put taxi drivers out of business and so on. Uber was supposedly just relying on its low-wage labor force, precarious drivers long enough to get the robot taxis on the road. But and we've gone through this arc now where 15 years ago, people were saying, so a self-driving car is an extremely hard problem to get a machine to navigate around streets and people and other cars. If this is even possible, it won't be for many years. And then we hit the sort of top of the hype cycle where, Elon Musk promises that the robotaxis are coming next year. Every year, he's been doing it for like the past 8 years. Every year he says they're coming next year. There was that hype cycle, and now we're sort of back on the downswing of it, where people are like, oh, wait, this is a very hard problem that we will not solve for a long time, if ever. On top of the fact that just replacing, internal combustion cars with battery powered cars does not really address either the ecological or the social consequences of car-centric societies and development, but that's a sort of a whole other question. So that's sort of my long-winded answer. Is the climate crisis has just gotten worse and worse, and the political consequences of how we deal with it more and more pressing, while in certain ways, I think the pressure toward automation is still there and is still something we should think about in terms of both its promises and its perils, but it's also sort of a busted flush in certain ways. And it's sort of a thing that is brought up both to discipline workers and also to give people hope in some sort of a better future, even when you look behind the curtain, often there's not a lot there.
Okay, and you mentioned that, 10 years ago, you were thinking that, it was this high point of the sort of talking about automation. I think both in the mainstream and in sort of political left circles of thinking through automated futures. But so that sort of leads me to one of my other questions, which is, can you talk a little bit about how this book project came into existence? I'm going to ask you afterwards about the genre you kind of create for yourself, which again makes it kind of a unique book project. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how it sort of came together.
Yeah, so it had a very kind of long gestation, so it's back at this point, we're going back at like a decade or more to sort of where the kind of key ideas came together. So long ago that this was when I was writing a blog, which is what we did in those days, and maybe we'll go back to now that the social media sphere is sort of imploding and fragmenting. But this was when I was still in graduate school and was sort of making my first forays into more public kinds of writing. And I often joke that the book is basically the consequence of a kid who grew up on Star Trek and then read Karl Marx. And one of the places that led me, as a fan specifically of Star Trek: The Next Generation, being the show from the 80s and 90s that I grew up on, was, looking at that, it was very much shaped by the sort of utopian liberal vision that Gene Roddenberry had toward the end of his life, where, it's very kind of made explicit at certain points in the show that this is like a post-scarcity society, meaning material want has been overcome. People have what they need to flourish in life, and that what they do beyond that is really sort of their freely chosen pursuit of their self-realization. And which is, in a sense, it's a communist vision. It is the world of from each according to their ability to each according to their need, in a way. But it wasn't made by Marxists, it was made by liberals. And as a consequence of that, its politics, especially in the next generation era, are very underspecified. there's again sort of like what I was alluding to about mainstream automation discourse. There was this sort of sense of inevitability of, if you have the technology to, give you what you need without, without human labor, without it being ecologically unsustainable, then why wouldn't you have this communist society? It's materially possible, after all. Why wouldn't you have that? And of course, that's where the Marxism comes in, of if you're starting from the standpoint of a class society like ours, things don't happen just because they're technically feasible. Things happen because of, class power and political power and the struggles and the conflicts and the coalitions that arise from that. And so that then led me to the first iteration of this sort of this framework and this thought experiment, which was a post called Anti-Star Trek, where I was basically just taking sort of the post-scarcity world of Star Trek and doing the thought experiment about, like, what if you had all that technology was the same, but you still had something that looked more like capitalist class relations. In other words, a small group of wealthy property owners trying to maintain the power that they have in our system. What would that look like? And that led me into what eventually we're going to call rentism in the book, which is, using intellectual property protections and various kinds to kind of impose scarcity where there need not necessarily be scarcity in order to preserve property relations, right? And so that was the first iteration. After I published that, an old comrade of mine read it and sort of emailed me and said, "This is really an interesting thought experiment, but it's sort of interesting that you didn't mention climate crisis at all, or ecology." And so that gives you a sense of where sort of my head was at, and I think more people's heads were at back then, was that I didn't immediately think of that. But as soon as he said it, of course, I thought, oh yeah, you're right. That is something that's really needs to be worked in here. And so I did work it in what became then the essay version of this in Jacobin, that then led to the book, which is the structure. The essay is basically the same at a shorter length than what the book is. Where I came up with this sort of like this sort of like 2x2 cross of, not only is there this political question of like how is society structured, but there's also this question of like, basically, how bad are things going to get climate and ecology wise, and how are we going to be, how is that going to interact with the politics and the class structure of the society that faces that crisis? And so that was sort of, in the end of all of those iterations, the sort of full picture of the, I was trained as a sociologist, and so all sociologists love a 2x2 grid. So once I had the 2x2 grid, I figured, I really have something here.
Yes, it reminds me a lot of Eric Olin's Eric Olin writes very famous 2x2 grid that was also I read about in Jacobin.
I actually got a chance. I did get a chance to meet it. I met Eric a few times before he died, and we were both speaking at an event once, like after the book had already come out, and I sort of explained, gave him the elevator pitch of what the book was, and he was like, "Oh, a 2x2 diagram. That's great. I love that."
So before we get into the futures, which we're about to do, I did want to ask you about genre. You call this book social science fiction. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and how that's different from science fiction, and how that's different from futurism?
Right. So, it's sort of, in a sense, it's not science fiction because I'm not much of a fiction writer. Although the book was certainly influenced not just by social theory, by Marxism and so on, but also by these sort of there's sort of the odd sort of fringes of fiction that sort of look more like social science. One of the more obscure ones that has influenced me a lot was Olaf Stapledon, who wrote about 100 years ago and wrote these, books like Last and First Men and Star Maker, which are these books that sort of as if they're written by like an alien anthropologist describing like thousands of years of, civilizational history. It's not like a traditional sort of narrative, but it's fiction, obviously. So that sort of thing influenced me. And I was just sort of trying to think through what we can do with the tools of social science or social theory that's different than the sort of what we normally do in terms of analyzing the present and the past to kind of understand the sort of the structures of our present, the sort of the hidden social relations that structure the present. And I felt like a lot of the kind of science fiction that I like is the kind that sort of has underpinning it some kind of a social theory like that, something that sort of world builds, as they say, that creates the sort of basis for why things are like this. And and Star Trek had enough of it that I wanted to try to sort of build out more of it, right? And so I thought this is at a moment where I was sort of, on the trajectory that will eventually lead to me leaving academia and leaving grad school, where I was like, I wanted to do some different interesting things, and do them in a way where, I'm not just telling a story about the future. I'm also not predicting the future per se. I'm just trying to sort of set some boundaries and parameters for like how we think about where we are situated now and where we might go, both what the constraints and what the freedoms are. And that, I sort of hit on sort of social science fiction as the sort of the terminology I wanted to use for that, as a way of essentially doing what you would do as a sociologist, except pushing it forward into the future rather than remaining forward and, present and backward looking.
So in your book, you take us through a typology of 4 features, as we said, a 2x2 grid on how, based on how power is organized. So that's hierarchy versus equality, and how plentiful resources are. So that's scarcity versus abundance. So you did talk a little bit about how you came upon these variables, but what kind of futures do those give us, and sort of what kinds of, how is that different from other ways that people have sort of done social scientific-y fiction, or have thought about the future in social science?
Right. So the first thing to say, I guess, obviously, is that this is the nature of an exercise like this, is that it makes distinctions and chooses what to emphasize and what to leave out in a certain way. And so I've periodically people will bring up elements that I don't really foreground. So if like culture and ideas, or religion, things like this are obviously moving forces in the world. They're just not things that I sort of put in the foreground. I wanted to sort of put both sort of the material basis of social life and its political and sort of social structure in the sort of the foreground of what I was doing. And so this hierarchy versus, the axis of hierarchy versus equality, I could easily have called really the axis of class struggle, because the specific form of hierarchy that I'm talking about in this book, for the most part, at least in terms of how it structures the overall sort of social world that I'm describing, is something like the capitalist class hierarchy, in which wealth and power is concentrated in a small number of hands, but also sort of abstracted through the medium of money. And that, obviously in a capitalist system, most people without access to the means of production are selling their labor power. And so, again, that gets back to this sort of question of like Star Trek versus anti-Star Trek, and like what are the power relations and the class relations and the property relations that sort of underpin how social life plays out at any given level of technological development. And then this sort of scarcity versus abundance is then also a bit of it can be a bit of a tricky or a misleading framing, because it's a particular type of scarcity and a particular type of abundance that I'm talking about. Because what is scarce in the sort of scenarios that I sketch out in the book is explicitly not human labor. It's not a scarcity. It's sort of not a scarcity of the sort of the human labor to make the commodities that run society. We're imagining the Star Trek world where you have the replicator or something like that sort of does away with the need for all that human labor. But that then the sort of ecological and the climate piece of it is where there is still an underlying, what's actually scarce is the things that capitalism historically has not treated as scarce, right? That capitalism we've gotten into the position we're in precisely because nature was treated as a free gift, and the sort of externalities of capitalist production, the pollution and the waste, were sort of treated as things that did not have to have a cost placed on them. And so in a way, I'm sort of looking to invert that logic and say, what if we make no longer, the things that are scarce now, our ability to get food, to get housing, to get healthcare, what if those are no longer scarce, but that there is still a sort of an underlying scarcity of like what can our ecosystem sustain, right? Like one other thing that I clearly wanted to foreclose, right, was, and this certainly I think has been borne out, is like, we ain't going to Mars, folks. Like that there's certain, like I can imagine myself into a lot of kind of near and medium future scenarios that are kind of wild, but human civilization that is not primarily based on the Earth's ecosystem for the vast majority of us is like not one of those things I can imagine myself out of, based on, I think, what reasonable physical and social science tells us today. And so those were the boundaries that I wanted to set in terms of what I wanted to talk about and what the particular kinds of hierarchies that I wanted to think about either preserving or overcoming, and the particular kind of scarcity or abundance that sort of ecological basis might provide.
So I think that this is not overstating. Your most optimistic version of the future is the communistic future that you describe, which has both equality and abundance. And you do hazard some ideas of things that might get us closer to that version of the future that are sort of like policy oriented. And one of them is UBI. Or universal basic income. Is universal basic income still kind of top of your list as a sort of revolutionary reform? Or have you seen other kinds of policies that maybe in the past few years, or that have been at least floated in the past few years, that might do that better or are more likely to happen?
I still think there's not really a substitute for universal basic income as both a demand and something to sort of think with, in terms of its recognition that we still are operating in, a monetized society in which access to the cash nexus is paramount for most of our survival, while trying to break that sort of connection between selling your labor and gaining an income that's so foundational to the way that capitalist hierarchies work. I do think it's, the basic income is another thing that has gotten a lot more sort of popular discussion over the last decade. And I do think it's important to situate it in the right way, because there's sort of some blind alleys you can go down with it that I think we've seen more and more in recent years. So there was a debate, for example, there's been a recurring debate between proponents of basic income and other people who defend something, like the perspective of what's called like universal basic services, where the idea is rather than just giving everyone a check, shouldn't we be substantively providing for sort of for the like substantive needs people have, like housing, like healthcare, like education. And I think in certain aspects that's like clearly correct, and particularly because there is this sort of right libertarian version of basic income, which sees it specifically as not a supplement or sort of a going beyond like the welfare state, but as a replacement for it and a way of undermining and destroying it, so that instead of getting universal healthcare, you just get a voucher, which in the case of something like healthcare is just like obviously manifestly, actually it's inequality in the form of equality, right? Because our substantive need for all variety of reasons of age and disability and happenstance and so many other things, our substantive need for healthcare vary. And so giving everyone the same check is actually results in an extremely unequal outcome. So I think, it's important. And I think, there's a periodic kind of like illusion that basic income proponents on the left sometimes have, that like, oh, isn't this great because it allows us to have this sort of like right-left alliance that can like unite around this. And it's like, no, because that doesn't work, because fundamentally what right-wing proponents of basic income see in it and what they want it to do is fundamentally different than what the left, should want it to do. It's a way to sort of break down what's left of the welfare state rather than to supplement it. It's a way of sort of like stabilizing a particular kind of precarious capitalist wage labor rather than giving people the freedom to move beyond it. That comes up even in something as just sort of like basic and quantitative as like, what is the level of the basic income? Because if it's true, like, the definition of universal basic income, the basic is supposed to mean like, however you define this, it provides for your basic needs, meaning that you can survive on it without working. But, as soon as you get that basic income down to a low enough level that people cannot survive just on it, then it just becomes a subsidy to low wage labor. You're just subsidizing low wage employers because people are still having to work, but you can pay them less because they have this other supplement. So yeah, I think for all of that, I still think there is no substitute for basic income as a demand and as a concept. But I think as it's become more mainstreamed, we've seen all these pitfalls and limitations a little bit more clearly. So we have to be, and I also, as an aside, I would love to never again see another story about someplace doing a pilot program of basic income, which is neither universal nor basic. And because it's some sort of like means tested thing for fucking $100 a month or something. So, there's mainstream presence has its downsides in that regard. But yeah, that's sort of my answers. And for all that, I'm still not willing to sort of let go of it as something to demand and to talk about.
So also in this communistic future, we see that there is a type of equality, but you're actually very clear that this is not a full, that hierarchies do still exist. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of equality you think is possible through these sort of like political changes, and what kind of hierarchies might kind of persist post-capitalism, even in the most optimistic version of it?
Yeah, so what I was trying to do there, part of what led me down that direction of talking about sort of the types of hierarchies that persist or that develop in a post-scarcity society, it was in response to sort of a reaction, the surprising reaction that I got when I was talking about these ideas in the process of writing the book, with people who would be like, well, wouldn't this communist future where we have replicators to provide for ourselves and we don't have to work for anybody for wages, wouldn't this just be boring? Wouldn't it take a sort of like conflict and like struggle out of life? And I found that a strange objection. Like, feel like I have faith in people finding fulfilling things to do with their lives, but it did make me think about how to present this in a way, because utopias are harder to write than dystopias for this reason, that they can be boring, and so I was trying to dig in to, where are the sort of sources of conflict even in a sort of a post-capitalist, post-scarcity society. So, I rely on Cory Doctorow's book, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which takes place in a sort of post-scarcity society where a crew of people are coming together to run what used to be Disneyland, and the thing I wanted to get into in this question of like hierarchy and equality is that when I'm talking about overcoming hierarchy, I'm talking about the sort of big master key social hierarchy that shapes the entire society and that you cannot opt out of. So like in a pre-capitalist society, that might have to do with, kings and landowning nobles and, peasants who are tied to them. In capitalism, of course, it's all filtered through the cash nexus, through money, that who has money, who has access to money is what determines the hierarchy. And even to the extent that there are sort of status hierarchies and of other kinds that are not directly monetary, it ultimately comes down to translating all of it into and out of money. And so what I wanted to think about was like, it's very different to think about these hierarchies if they can be opted out of, and they are these sort of more, postmodern or post-structuralist kind of like fragmentary hierarchies that, they're specific to a kind of a voluntary affinity group or something, rather than something like the need to make money to survive, or even things that appear more sort of fragmentary or like, the bourgeois nuclear family, which also cannot exist without both the sort of the state and the market being such that it is reproduced and that it is sort of backstopped, as we see now with sort of the homophobic attacks on trans people, on reproductive rights, and so on. So all of those were the hierarchies that I had my mind set on. That's the distinction I want to make, is that it's possible to have a society without those big master hierarchies. The sort of like the metaphor I used at one point was of like a magnet that has, you do the experiment where you put a magnet on the table and dump iron filings on it. They make the shape of the magnetic field. The iron filings are drawn into that shape of the magnet, and capitalism is a magnet like that, with capital at one end and labor on the other. And even if not everything in the society perfectly aligns with that magnetic field, it's all drawn into that sort of master polarity. Versus like, if you're in a crew of people in a post-scarcity society trying to run a theme park, you might you might find yourself being sort of on the outs with the group running it. You might find yourself, for a variety of good or bad reasons, sort of at the wrong end of a status hierarchy. But worst case scenario, you have the material ability to walk away. There's this sort of, it's Albert Hirschman, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. If you have, the key is that you have through some combination of having a voice in what's happening and having the ability to exit from it, that you have some degree of freedom in that scenario, which doesn't mean that it's always going to be it's not going to be the greatest experience for everyone all the time, but it is different from the world that the hierarchies that you can't opt out of, essentially.
Okay, so moving to your second future. And also it was just put in the chat, but just a reminder, please share your questions. If you have any, you can drop them in at any time, and we'll start moving through them in about 10 or so minutes. So yes. So let's talk about your second vision of a future, your second future, which is rentism, and seems to be related to what your sort of new project. And it's, I think, especially prescient of all of the sort of visions that you have of the future. It looks at new ways of holding property that come through IP law, and you have some discussion of Bitcoin, considering, like, especially, I guess, in the past few weeks, the news around crypto collapses, and also in the intervening time, I think NFTs became a thing between this book being published and now. Could you talk about how rentism, as you defined it, is more or less prominent today, and also why these things are sort of prone to collapse, and how that might sort of affect the rentist future?
Yeah, so the grounding, so here we're rentism, this is the sort of the anti-Star Trek concept, is how do you preserve class relations, capitalist-like class relations in an environment where material scarcity can be overcome. And the grounding insight here for me is that property, private property, excludable property that someone can claim ownership of and exclude other people from, is a creature of the state, is a creature of law. It's not a thing that sort of naturally exists, right? And that's not just true of, like, the digital world where, copyright makes it so that it's illegal to copy things that could otherwise be copied for free. But it goes back to the beginnings of capitalism, to the enclosures, to taking common lands that were shared by people and were not treated as anybody's private property, literally putting fences around them and saying, now this is owned by somebody. And there has to be a state that enforces that, or some other power that enforces that, for that enclosure to happen, for it to be real, for someone to get away with it, essentially. It's that. And so what you see now is that as more and more of the economy is sort of like the immaterial or the digital, or things that can be copied almost for free, whether it's music files or it's books, digital books, or it's whatever. This sort of opens the door to some post-scarcity options, but then it also is very threatening, obviously, to people whose entire vision of how society and economy is supposed to work is that you have excludable property that you can make people pay for. And so what's interesting, I think, about, like, the crypto thing particularly, I could go on a whole other tangent about crypto because it has different dimensions, and it's like such a creature of the 2008 crisis itself, that it makes sort of a good guidepost for a lot of this stuff. But with the stuff like NFTs, for example, particularly, you look at the people promoting that stuff, the NFTs, or Web3, which was this sort of fake new version of the internet that they were trying to claim would be done with crypto in the last year or two. All of it, you read the people who are promoting it, the people who are making the case for it, will be talking about this as a way of creating digital scarcity, artificial scarcity, and they believe that that's a good thing, because they believe that they want the basis of society, and therefore the basis of power and wealth, to be what can you own that you can then charge other people the right to access. Now, in terms of what crypto ended up doing and why it ended up being just this thing that's just prone to sort of speculative bubbles and collapses, is that there was, I think, in the beginning, I think a sort of an honest belief, at least among some factions in originating this stuff, that you could essentially create scarcity without the hand of the state there to enforce it, right? So one of the Bitcoiner slogans, or the crypto people slogans, is code is law, right? That if you code this thing correctly and you use the cryptographic, mechanisms that are used in crypto tokens in Ethereum or Bitcoin or whatever, that then you can enforce this sort of artificial scarcity of digital tokens without some external, without a state or without any external force to do so. But this runs up against the problem that all of these things, like, they're not actually money. You can't actually really do anything with them that's external to the crypto sphere itself. And so to the extent that code is law, it's only law within the sort of playground of crypto itself. And so what I think you saw happen over the last 15 years of crypto's development is I think gradually the true believers, the cypherpunks, the people who really believed in the sort of code as law and believed in the blockchain as like a technology were gradually displaced by more and more like garden variety scammers, like people whose vocation is scamming and just found crypto to be the latest speculative scam to get in on. So there are people who come from, literally the message boards where get rich quick scammers get together to talk about their schemes. They migrate into Bitcoin. People who used to be running crooked poker websites where the VIPs could look at other players' cards migrated into running Bitcoin exchanges. Like, that's literally who the chief legal counsel of FTX, the exchange that just collapsed, his background was in working for a crooked poker site. And I think that's because ultimately people realized that, like, the claims for what it could do, were based on a delusion about property independent of the state and independent of some like social force that gives it meaning. And so then it just became, Beanie Babies or 90s baseball cards or whatever kind of like speculative asset class you want to take. And it's, and which is not to sort of diminish the fact that I do think that like a lot of our era's kind of scam technologies, it was sort of a false solution to a real need, right? Like, it's not coincidental that this stuff starts. Bitcoin is released in 2008, and makes the original Genesis block of Bitcoin makes reference directly to the financial crisis and the bank bailouts. That, like, instead of some kind of change to the financial system that would bail out ordinary people rather than banks, we didn't get that. Obama bailed out the banks; he didn't bail out us. What we got instead, it was crypto, and I feel like that makes it that's one of the reasons I feel like it makes such a good kind of guide to the whole vibe of post 2008 capitalism.
Okay, great. Moving. So I want to, maybe we'll come back to more crypto NFT stuff, but I do want to move us to our third future to talk a little bit about that, which is your vision of socialism, which is a combination of equality and scarcity. And it's also the chapter in which you really sort of talk about the climate crisis most sort of explicitly, and that's sort of what you take up and are sort of dealing with. And so can you talk a little bit about what the sort of vision of the like, I don't know, resolution seems the wrong word, the sort of what kind of comes out of an equality and scarcity combination, and also where you see some of the hope for the future in terms of mitigating climate collapse.
Right. So this is the world where, like, right, in the sort of communism future, I've sort of wished away, like, I've sort of fictional technologied my way into, okay, we found a way to basically stabilize the climate to such a degree that we can sort of live in the Star Trek world without having to worry about that too much. Now, in this chapter, where I'm coming back and saying, okay, we know that really, it's even more clear now than it was when I wrote it, that, the climate change is happening now, that like things are underway that we're not going to be able to reverse in the near term. There's going to have to, even if we can decarbonize much more rapidly than we are, a lot of the damage has been done. There's going to be dislocations. There's going to be, people are going to have to move. There's going to be huge effects on agriculture. Places are going to be underwater and so on. And so then the question just becomes what, if you filter that through, a kind of a capitalist class structure, you get sort of the future will end on that, where, the human cost of that is just sort of paid by the people that can't afford to get away from it. But if you imagine a more egalitarian future, then we try to think about how do we sort of live in this world together, in a world where, even if we have the technology that, can still make life a lot easier by automating a lot of things, what do we do to sort of, how can we come together in a process of sort of like ecological reconstruction? That means changing both, sort of rebuilding the way we live as people in a way that is, that is sort of consistent with maintaining the Earth's capacities to support us, and to some extent, cleaning up the damage that's been done, right? That ultimately, if that's much of the work of the future, is the sort of process of cleaning up the damage and of sort of building a world that that we all want to live in, which is, I think even if we take seriously and take the sort of worst case scenario seriously of where we're already headed, I believe it is still possible for us to imagine, a decent future for ourselves and for future generations. It's not going to be obviously one that consumes, burns as much carbon as the society that we live in now. It's going to mean probably, travel is going to have to change. Sort of what and how we consume is going to have to change. The ways that we sort of organize living with each other and caring for each other is going to have to change. But that, like, ultimately, the idea that producing more and more, consuming more and more energy, spewing more and more pollution is the only path to sort of human flourishing and prosperity is a capitalist idea, and one that I wanted to sort of break away from and say it's not either we sort of find a magical fix for the climate crisis and sort of live happily ever after, or we're just doomed to eternal misery. But that there is a way to conceive of a social structure in which, there's sort of trade-offs and there's sacrifices and there's big shifts that have to be made in the way that we live, but that doesn't have to mean sort of large-scale suffering, which is what it could and will mean under other sets of social relations.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask one more question and then we're going to move to some audience questions. So the final question is on the final future, which you just referenced, the fourth future, which is exterminism, which is hierarchy and scarcity. In that chapter, the example is a Matt Damon movie called Elysium, which I actually haven't seen, but in which the very rich are sort of completely sheltered away from the rest of the population and have basically eternal life and a wonderful existence, and everyone else is doing pretty badly. And to be honest, reading it, it felt maybe more than it did in 2016, like that we might be in an exterminist present already, that maybe has been any sort of those tensions have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and maybe in particular. But do you think that this is a sort of a likely future? Do you see this in the present? What sort of, what's your read on how sort of true to life that is?
I mean, the thing that's sort of darkly funny to me about this part is that when I first was writing this and when the book came out, I got a lot more reactions of sort of like, overall it's a cool book, cool ideas, but like this chapter in particular, this seems like a little like over the top in its sort of dystopian darkness. And now more likely I'm going to get the reaction of like, oh yeah, this is the one that's going to happen or is happening. And I mean, I think, it's sort of related to what we talked about at the very beginning, that like where the techno fixes for our social crisis are not coming. And so instead what we're getting is increasingly a ruling class that wants to find a way to hide and a way to protect itself. I mean, I'll say, to get to another Star Trek theme, to DS9, which you have right behind you, there's an episode of Deep Space Nine where the crew is transported to 21st century San Francisco, where in the year 2024, where the poor are basically being warehoused in sanctuary cities, which are basically like concentration camps. And there's like a riot that happens there, the Bell riots, which are big in the Star Trek lore, then one of the things that's supposed to kind of catalyze the transition from like our hell world to the Star Trek future. And as it turns out, in the year 2022, warehousing the homeless and the mentally ill in camps is in fact a bipartisan project of politicians throughout the country, including in San Francisco. So we are right on track for the Bell riots in 2024. The only sort of the only thing I can say optimistically on that is that fortunately, the ruling class is quite deluded about how much they can actually completely hide away from the rest of us. They may believe that they have these fantasies of like setting up libertarian utopias on oil rigs in the ocean or like hiding on a private island somewhere, but like actually their lives do still rely on the labor of millions of people. And so like those things sort of like the crypto fantasy of escaping from the state, like this, the seasteaders and all of it. It's like that at that level, it's fantastical. It's not going to, as much as they might like to just sort of like hide in their castles from us, they can't really. But that doesn't mean that they can't have an increasingly violent, increasingly militarized, increasingly carceral society in which the consequences of extreme inequalities of wealth and extreme inequality, and extreme levels of misery among the population are simply addressed by liberals and conservatives alike by increased repression. I think that's sort of where we are.
Okay, we're going to move on to audience questions. If you're in the audience and you've been sitting on a question, please share it. First, we're going to hear from Greg, who asks a question that I'm also very curious about. A number of books have appeared in recent years arguing that humanity can't really deal with climate change unless degrowth is implemented. Have you looked into this? And if so, do you have any comments about degrowth?
It's a complicated one. So degrowth is, the way this is generally put, I guess, as the way I see it sort of portrayed often in these left debates, is that degrowth is pitched against some sort of like, there's like on the one side, you have this sort of like Promethean version of like, we can just grow our way out of the problems, that if we have enough economic growth and enough incentives for technological development, we'll find ways to overcome the limits imposed by the ecological crisis, versus degrowth as we need to live simpler, less energy intensive sort of lives. Insofar as it's at that level of generality, I'm sort of, I guess, pro degrowth. I think often the degrowth kind of advocates, there's various people who use that term and mean different things by it, and there's a large body of writing that I'm certainly not expert in. I think what tends to happen in the more sort of public-facing debates is that the whole terminology just gets us confused and gets us into a place that I think from like a sort of a social theoretical perspective and a left perspective is not very helpful, because again, growth as an abstraction is itself kind of inherently a capitalist concept. It's to use another common line joke people make about crypto, it's number go up is the idea here, right? That like in capitalism, growth is just like if the number goes up, if more capital is accumulating, more money is accumulating, the stock market is going up, that's growth and that's good. But that's a layer of abstraction placed over this whole world of what substantively is growing or shrinking, right? That like carbon emissions are growing, access to public education is shrinking, right? That there's like actual substantive human things going on here and physical things going on here that like I think we need to, those are what we need to be talking about. And it is often what the degrowthers are talking about. But I think once it gets pitched at the level of like, growth, yes or no, that we're already sort of stuck in some sort of bourgeois ideology that is not helpful to us.
Okay, our next audience question is from Josh, who says, please discuss what role, if any, debt plays in these futures.
Well, it's crucial to something like the rentist future, because it's a way, like it's another way to keep people locked into the sort of monetary system, right? When if like debt is ultimately another relation that has to be enforced by the state, so it does require it requires the sort of social hierarchy to enforce it, but it's a way of saying like forcing you to engage with the monetized capitalist systems to find ways to make money. So if you even if people potentially have access to whatever, a replicator that could like make their food for them, if you then also load them up with a debt and says you have to find a way to repay this debt or we can lock you up, then that forces you to engage with the economy of what can I get someone to pay me to do, which is the key to something like the rentist society, where otherwise there's not a clear, there's no longer the sense of necessarily you will starve if you don't get somebody to pay you a wage. So it's how do we maintain this system of forcing people to work for wages, and debt is crucial to doing that. As it has been in the recent history of capitalism, right? That like the part of the disciplining of the working class is in rich countries in particular has been about increasing loads of debt, educational debt especially, but also other kinds of debt that make it more difficult to resist the system in any way, because ultimately, yeah, it's a mechanism by which you can be punished.
Our next question is from Itamar, and he asks, I wonder what the place of identity is in these futures, race, nation, civic identities, etc. Do you see these as superficial byproducts of the class system, or as systems whose legacies will preoccupy and figure into these futures?
I mean, I certainly, I think that, again, this is one of those things that I just sort of made a choice to sort of put on a back burner when I was constructing this particular argument. I think, clearly, I think the history of humanity would suggest that all of these sort of like identities, of various kinds, national identities, religious identities, other kinds of identities, race, are things that, they don't just sort of like turn on and off like a switch, but they are lived in the context of social relations, right? Like I don't, I think you can't like racism is not merely a product of capitalism in some abstract sense, but also the particular way that race manifests itself in a capitalist society is specific to it. And so what would happen to all those identities, where they would go, how they would change, how people would have the sort of freedom or the desire to sort of muddy them in a society, in an environment in which those things were not directly tied back to capital accumulation, is, I think, an interesting thing to think about. And like, there is good sort of science fiction that goes sort of in that direction more. Because it's to use the metaphor I used earlier, it's like it's taking out the magnet of the capital relation, and everything looks different. It doesn't mean all these other sort of like ways of establishing social identities or social hierarchies disappear, but they're no longer all being drawn into that magnetic field where your position in a racial hierarchy is also what determines your position in an economic hierarchy, right? Or your position in a gender hierarchy determines your position in an economic hierarchy, right? You take out that sort of structuring relationship, and then all of these things, I think, will, even more so than they already do today, will be sort of the subject of refashioning and reimagining and experimentation with different ways of ultimately of imagining our social world with each other, which is what all this stuff, I think, is ultimately about.
Okay, great. I just do want to encourage audience members, if you have more questions, we're looking for questions, not comments. You can reformat your comment to be a question if you already put it in. So we're going to move on to another question from Greg, which is, have you looked much at anarchism to see if our governmental structures might possibly move in that direction, including what's happening with the roughly 3 million people in Rojava, Northeast Syria, who are living under a sort of anarchism? Any thoughts in this regard?
I mean, I guess I'm sort of, well, there's many kinds of anarchism, obviously. The kind that I find most interesting is one where, especially when you're doing the sort of speculative exercise that we've been talking about here, there's not a clear distinction to me between communism and anarchism, right? Like Marx is clear that like the state ultimately is a function of class society. And there's of course the cliches about the state withering away and this, and we can debate how well that's rooted in Marx's writing and so on. But I do tend to think that, like, again, one of the reasons that I could have called the axis of equality and hierarchy in the book the class axis. I could have just said it was sort of capital versus labor. And I didn't do that because I wanted to sort of get at this idea that we are trying to break down the idea of any single structuring hierarchy that everybody is forced into, with some people placed at the top, right? And so to the extent that things like Rojava, these, or we talk about this, we used to talk about the Zapatistas, that these experiments are taking seriously that idea of breaking down any kind of central structuring hierarchy as part of the project of getting out of capitalism. I think that's sort of essential. I mean, I take some anarchism with my Marxism always. And as an aside, I think we can, as Marxists, we can go back to using that terminology. There was a time, I think, when people thought of like libertarian socialism or something like that as like a nicer, like as a euphemism that didn't sound as sketchy as anarchism. But like now, libertarianism associates with things that are so much worse than even the dumbest forms of anarchism that we can just go back to being sympathetic to anarchism.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one of my questions. So as something of an amateur scholar of zombie media, it seems like we're like exclusively inundated with post-apocalyptic visions of exterminism, not any of the other kinds of futures in mainstream pop culture in particular, with very few exceptions. I would say that the Star Treks are one of them. Why is this, do you think? And what are some non-exterminist future forward books or movies that you could kind of recommend to anyone who's sort of thinking in the future, but trying to imagine a maybe more optimistic or less nihilistic, at least, version of the future?
Yeah, I mean, so part of the problem comes to something I mentioned earlier, which is that people find it harder to make utopias not boring, right? That it's easier to find conflict in a sort of a story that's based on brutality and oppression and scarcity. It works in Star Trek to the extent that it keeps its stakes low enough to make this feel like an interesting world, but also one that's basically good to live in, right? Like Star Trek: The Next Generation works because it's like a workplace drama a lot of the time, where they also happen to meet aliens and like time travel. So I think it's a big part of it, and in addition to just the fact that I think there's something. Dystopia, when you just like take it by itself, is the more reactionary and the more sort of like, friendly to the interests of the people that fund like certainly big, TV and movie science fiction. Like there's something, people can sort of take comfort in the idea that it's like everything is dystopian and we're all screwed, and that, right, and that there's nothing that can be done about it, and that sort of suits the ruling class just fine. In terms of, there are people who are better versed in sort of the modern, what's going on right now in science fiction, who probably have better ideas than me. But just to think about some of the classics, right? Like, and to shout out somebody that really should have played probably more of a role in the book than she did. Ursula Le Guin would be somebody who obviously writes about, there are dystopian aspects to the stories that he writes, but in things like The Dispossessed, or, even The Left Hand of Darkness, or Always Coming Home, there's thinking through both in terms of a sort of a degrowth concept of what a good but not sort of Promethean, like endless growth focused society would look like, as well as how like gender and sexuality could operate and could change in those environments. I mean, that's always going to be a classic, or what I do use in the book, of course, Kim Stanley Robinson, the Mars trilogy most famously, but more recently things like New York 2140 that tries to like move things, look at sort of like dealing with climate change mitigation in a way that is not totally dystopian. There's also his more recent book, which I actually haven't read, The Ministry for the Future. And to shout out a sort of a weirder one that it's probably less well known today, but that I have a soft spot for, Ken MacLeod's books, particularly his trilogy, The Star Fraction, The Stone Canal, The Cassini Division. He's someone I would say is sort of an anarchist inflected Marxist, and I particularly like those books as a guy who's just been a socialist for many years and been around the socialist movement for a long time, that these are books that end in the far future, end in a far future post-scarcity society, but begin with like Trotskyists hanging around in Scottish pubs in the 1970s. And so like that connection between the sort of the world of our politics and the future is something that I've always loved. And so I don't know if we have I didn't see what you're referring to, Miranda, but I'll take whatever question we got.
Okay. So Daniel says, I'm agreeing with your goals, but not your assumptions. Property appears to be older than the state. So does hierarchy. We find limited property emerging spontaneously in insane asylums, Goffman, and currency in the form of cigarettes and prisoner of war camps. We can even see it in primates prior to the development of Homo sapiens. I would also point out that Star Trek universe, the world goes through hell before it comes back, built back better. The Third World War begins in the 2020s, I guess, with the Bell riots, and continues to the 2050s. So what are your justifications for your assumptions, and can you sort of rationalize the assumptions that the sort of like big premises that undergird this work?
I mean, I guess the question, I'm generally kind of allergic to these kind of trans-historical assumptions about how human societies work. And I think some of the like research that's done to kind of prop that up is a little bit suspect. I mean, I do think it comes down to, in some ways, like when you're talking about property, what are we really talking about, right? If we're talking, like, there's, the distinction can be made in a capitalist society between like personal property and like private property, meaning it's one thing to like own my clothes, and my toothbrush. It's another thing to own, to sort of own a business or a massive capital that is able to be deployed to earn more capital. And like, land is, be able to own land and exclude others from it is, that's the stuff that I'm saying. It exists in various forms, yes, in many different kinds of societies, but it is ultimately doesn't exist independent of those societies. It requires these complex institutions and social relations to actually make it so that, like, if I own some land and somebody else comes on it, I can either call someone who will come and arrest them, or I can get away with shooting them or whatever. Like, that only happens within a certain matrix of social relations, and in a different matrix of social relations, it could be otherwise and is otherwise in many times and places. So yeah, I think if you want to define sort of like property narrowly enough, or sort of broadly enough in a sense, or sort of like to cover as many different forms of like relationships between human beings and like the physical world, sure. But I think the role that it takes on in capitalism is bigger, and it's qualitatively different. And I think we see with things like what we were talking about in the digital realm of these fights over intellectual property and so on, that there is a constant process of contesting where those boundary lines are, what we want to conceive of as property, what kind of, like, to what degree do we create social forces that enforce those distinctions and enforce those boundaries.
Okay, we have another question from Itamar, which also is a great question. I don't mean to sound too teacherly, as I do a lot of teaching, but this is actually, I think, great, and does not hits on something that we have not talked about, which is, should there be a role in imagining species destruction, or do you consider that to such efforts to be politically regressive?
What I'm kind of clarify what you mean by species destruction.
Itamar, if you want to drop that in, I take him to mean like the end of humanity.
Yeah.
So if that's not the case, do you drop it in the questions and we will clarify? But that's what I understand it as.
Yeah, that one, in a way, sort of like, it's sort of the obverse for me of going to Mars, in that it is sort of an unthinkable for me. And I think it's unthinkable in such a way that trying to think it leads us down some blind alleys that we don't want to go down. It's difficult. It's, unfortunately, it's now easy to imagine a future in which millions or even billions of people suffer and die as a result of the conditions that we've created on this planet. What is very difficult for me to imagine is one in which the human race literally becomes extinct, even in the worst case scenarios, right? And I think that in some ways, it's difficult for me to conceive of. And I think when we talk in those terms, often for some people, it's tempting to talk in those terms because it leads us to a way of arguing that sort of says, well, in some sense, we're all in this together, that like, even if like capitalists and workers or the global north and south seem to be sort of at odds in terms of their interests in what's happening to this planet, ultimately we all have to live here and our survival is at stake. And unfortunately, my argument, and part of why I'm so emphasize this sort of question of class structure and social hierarchies, is that I just don't believe that. And I think that it's sort of in a way dangerous for us to look away from the fact that insofar as the rich can find a way to hide away from us and, either kill or warehouse the surplus population in order to eke out a life for themselves on this planet, that is what is going to happen, barring the sort of social revolution that prevents it. So that's why I sort of, I'd leave it aside for reasons of sort of feasibility and thinkability, and also just because in a sense it's like the sort of the black hole of social theory, with no people, there's no society, and therefore no social theory. And so, like, what is it to even think of that?
Okay, we have gone through audience questions. I have one more, but please jump in if you have more questions. We will be able to answer, or able to have time to answer them. So I think just jumping back to the book, and I'm going to jump to the third future, of socialism, sort of like controversially on the left, you come out saying that there are going to be markets under socialism, or that markets have a role to play. So can you discuss sort of what your vision of markets under this version of socialism, which again is a combination of equality and scarcity, and are markets kind of necessary for any scarcity inflected future?
So I don't want to say necessary exactly, but what I wanted to do with that argument was to sort of, I do come down on the side of saying that, like, when I think about what is sort of essential to capitalism and what is essentially unfree and oppressive about capitalism, markets are not really in the center of that. And, for me, like, I just mean a market is meaning just any situation in which you put a price on something, right? And that's really all it is. And that can take a lot of different forms. Now, the capitalist market has a particular character owing to, again, the fact that it's part of a master social hierarchy of capital and of money that links everything together, so that, like, everything you want to do in the society is linked to your ability to access this form of payment. And most people can only do that by selling their labor power. But, like, there's plenty of ways in which you can embed market-like systems, if you just have some scarce resource that, you need to allocate. It can just be as simple as, like, space. So I think I used the parking example. I've written about the parking example. I use it in the book, where it's just like, suppose you want to, like, ration parking spaces, and does it make sense to, what's the most sort of, like, given that there's a limited number of them and you have to allocate them somehow, does it make sense to allocate them through some sort of market mechanism? Well, maybe. The problems with that arise not because I think of the market mechanism being there. They arise due to the fact of, how do you get the means of payment to engage in that market in the first place, right? So again, we are used to thinking of a world in which everyone enters a market as just a general capitalist market in which they have however much money they happen to have, which is dependent on their position in the capitalist class structure. Whereas you can also imagine a situation in which, for some specific market, everybody gets allocated a certain number of tokens to play in that market, that are allocated not based on wage labor or not based on property relations, that are based on some other political criteria. And then the market just becomes this sort of, like, neither inherently good or bad kind of mechanism. It's just a mechanism. It might work, it might not, it might end up having negative consequences that we have to deal with. But I just think it's a mistake to confuse market mechanisms with the system of capitalist accumulation. The idea that, like, capitalism is primarily about markets is itself, I think, a form of bourgeois ideology, right? That it's primarily about, I think, property relations and class relations, and markets even, play much less of a role in capitalism than capitalists would like us to think they do. And so the flip side of that is that things that look sort of like markets can still play a role even in not actually capitalist situations.
Okay, we have a question from Greg, who asks, your book was published in 2016. I think you're right. So you're now working on another book or project. Are you now working on another book or project? And if so, can you give us a peek at where things are at with that?
So where I've been going recently is to sort of take the other side of the premise of the book in a certain way, right? The premise being this sort of mass automation scenario in which, suppose we could have the Star Trek technology, suppose we could automate human labor. And I intentionally spent less time sort of motivating that than just sort of taking it as a premise, based on the idea that there are at least tendencies in capitalism that push that way, even if they may not be realized for some of the reasons we discussed earlier. So now I'm looking at what, like, increasingly to me in this post-2008 era has seemed to be really the predominance in capitalism of, what I call sometimes the problem of fake technology. This, like, so much money is made, there's so much hype is generated around things that turn out to be, I would say, inadequate solutions to the problems they claim to solve, even if they were real, but also they're not real. So like Theranos machines were not an answer to the lack of universal healthcare, but also they were completely fake, right? Self-driving cars don't actually resolve a lot of the problems of car-centric development or the resource extraction issues around lithium and batteries and so on, but also self-driving cars are fake. Crypto does not solve the problems of the financial systems. Also, it's not money. It's a scam. And so that to me, and so that's sort of where I'm trying to sort of work through that and think through what it says about the environment we are in, that we are being presented. Yeah, on one level, we are being presented with these sort of capitalist techno solutions that don't really get at, that are basically, that on the one level, the things that we need, the sort of the things that most fundamentally need to happen in order for us to live better lives and to sort of make it through the climate crisis, those are things that capitalism cannot provide because it can't make them profitable. But the second-rate solutions that capitalism can come up with and try to make money on are themselves not even like on their own terms real. So to me, that's sort of that comes to sort of like, I don't want, like any Marxist, I don't want to look like I'm saying this is sort of it. This is the final like contradiction of capitalism that it can't overcome, because I don't think there is any such thing. But it is a very real big contradiction, and it's the one that I'm the most interested in looking at now. Like, rather than if For Futures was about what could we do if we like liberated all this great technology from the capitalist relations of production, now this project is about what does it mean that capitalism seems incapable of even producing any technology we would want to make use of.
Okay, great. We have a question from Gabe, who asks, I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the role of the states in the socialist future. I'm particularly thinking about this in relation to some of the debates you mentioned around degrowth and allowing some space for further development in the third world.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. I mean, a lot of this, again, so like the state in a capitalist society is for its primary function is to preserve capitalist class relations. But there is also this question of like, the more things need to happen at scale, the more you need some sort of institution, something like a state, to organize them. And so when you're talking about, if you're talking about some like project of development that cannot sort of happen in a small scale decentralized way, then you need something that looks like a state. And then the problems of democratic accountability and all of that come up. They would come up in a different way if that state was not primarily concerned with protecting the property rights and the prerogatives of a class of wealthy capital accumulators. But yeah, I think it's I mean, that's why there's sort of like in the socialism chapter of For Futures, there's clearly a state of some kind or something that looks like a state, and in the communist chapter there kind of isn't, because that is sort of the Marxist premise of the state withering away. Is it withers away because there's sort of no need for it. Everything can be handled in enough of a sort of decentralized and distributed way that people can provide for themselves and each other without constructing these massive institutions, which then create the problems of the state. But yeah, that would be my sort of brief answer to where that fits in, is that like the climate crisis is the problem of the state and the problem of addressing the climate crisis are very closely intertwined, because so much of what we have to do to adapt to and mitigate the climate crisis has to be done at a large scale, and therefore has to be done with some kind of a state-like institution.
Okay, we have another question from the audience, which is, how can these futures help us think about the possible futures of higher education, particularly as researchers and teachers?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, especially now as we're, as education is itself in crisis, it's, we need to think about what education can be other than, something that justifies itself through the production of a capitalist labor force. I mean, that has been what certainly, in my experience with, university and college education, on the one hand, we were told to take out student debt and go to college to get good jobs. We were told in graduate school that we could get jobs, that are now disappearing and being, replaced with precarious labor. And I think, and you see there's so much like the miracle of education, both higher education and also like K-12 education. The miracle of it to me is that it is kept running by people who are so poorly paid and ill-treated, and yet find so much of value in what they're doing, and see so much, that human value in what education can be, even under these terrible institutional conditions, that they continue to do it. Now, as with many aspects of current capitalist society, the system is sort of eating its seed corn and sort of burning through its reserves as fast as possible in such a way that, like, I don't know how much longer things can really go on in this way. But the fact essentially that I would say what has happened in education is, to me, evidence of some deeply non-capitalist and communist impulses and motivations that have to be very powerful if they have, if the system has managed to not completely collapse, given the attempt to completely subordinate it to very short-term capitalist interests in a way that you would think that everybody would have fled it by now.
Okay, thank you. Our audience question queue is empty again, so if you have any last questions, please drop them in. If not, then I think this one we'll end on this one, which is, you mentioned that you get asked frequently, like, what are some things that you would change about the book? And you mentioned that your sort of acknowledgement that we might not know what Dogecoin is in a few years, which, if you're a denizen of the internet, you still know what Dogecoin is, but are there other things that you would like to change, or are there even like other futures that maybe you would, tweak the axis and you think are sort of maybe like more likely to happen or more helpful for thinking? Or do you think that this, that 2016 was still a good vantage point for looking into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic parameters of it have stayed, somewhat the same for me. The sort of the emphases have changed, obviously, in certain ways, but like, I think the era of capitalism we are in is basically still the same one. To use the William Gibson cliche, the future is still here and unevenly distributed, in both its sort of more hopeful and more repressive dimensions. I mean, there are definitely things, and there's certain things like that we talked about, some of the things that I could have included and didn't, just for the sake of having a sort of clean thought experiment. I certainly think I would probably now, if I was doing this, be working through more, like thinking through sort of social reproduction as a framework more. And so that would mean that, like, gender and the family, and how the society as a human institution is reproduced, would play into it more. I mentioned Ursula Le Guin would get more play. I think that's, in terms of how I think about what capitalism is and how to think about it as a system that reproduces itself in time. That's the piece that I think, I talk about it a little bit in certain parts of the book, but it's certainly something that's more top of mind for me now, in terms of thinking about, like, again, capitalism is not just as a thing that has to be understood in time and in human time, and therefore has to reproduce itself generationally, meaning both biological reproduction, but also cultural and social reproduction. And so, so bringing that in, I think, is probably the number one, and I think that could tie into all these different dimensions of, of the futures that we talked about. And so that's probably where I'd say my own thinking has evolved and deepened in the time since I wrote it.
Okay, we do have one last audience question, which is from Julia, who asks, what do you think it would be best to do now as citizens of the world in the US to create one of the better possible futures to the best of our abilities?
Organize with other people. And I'm not even going to say that can mean, that can mean as part of electoral type of campaigning, but that can mean building, your local mutual aid networks. It can mean organizing your workplace, obviously, but like, as Miriam Cobble likes to say, all the best things are done with other people. And that all, more part of my intention in writing the book and trying to position it in as a work, not of prediction, but of possibilities, right? Was to say, this is not where we're going. This is some parameters of what might be possible, and where we go, people make their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. But the people making their own history are important. But that can only be done collectively. And we are in a society that in many ways tries to fragment and atomize us. And the pandemic, of course, has intensified some of those tendencies. So yeah, find ways to be in community with and organize with other people in whatever context you happen to find yourself. That sounds sort of glib, but I also think it's just sort of fundamentally true and fundamentally the only thing we can do. And that recognition and that the pursuit of that is prior to and more fundamental than the specifics of political strategy and organizing, which are important, of course, but like you don't get there until you start with that thinking on that baseline.
Okay, wonderful. So I think with that, we will end this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Peter. I think I learned a lot from our discussion. And again, thank you to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy for hosting us. And with that, I'll say goodnight. Unless, Peter, do you have anything to add?
No, just thanks. It's been a great conversation. I'm amazed people still want to talk about this book all these years later. So, but it was good to take it in some somewhat new directions. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Great. All right. Thank you all so much.